the major players are looking at your house through Google Maps. They're looking at what neighborhood you're in. They see what route you take to your job based on your cell phone connectivity to towers, because they can profile you for knowing exactly how much money you're worth probably paying based on whatever scam might be appropriate. I have a pretty unorthodox path. Started many years ago, mid-90s. I was actually doing what is, I guess, a watered down version of what I was doing is called competitive intelligence, otherwise known as corporate spy work or corporate espionage work. But I was doing it overseas. And I was doing it well before there were any real laws wrapped around that kind of thing. So my job really was, if a large entity, whether it was a company or government, needed information about a competitive environment, I would be the guy they would call with my team to go get that. So I lived a very similar life in a lot of ways to people that you probably interview quite a bit, but I did it as a very high-end consultative practice for those companies. And I was very successful at it, decided to branch out and build a US operation for it in the early 2000s. And funny story is I brought my consultancy to the US. I got my stationery created. I got my business cards done. I got the website going and I was ready to go. And then 9/11 happened. And I was like, damn it. This everyone did. It was like, wow, that's a shock. This is going to be bad. And the economy took a hit. And basically companies kind of clammed up on buying what they would consider more luxury-like capabilities and services, which I never considered a luxury, but unfortunately they were too busy trying to do their day-to-day business rather than hire a spook like me to go figure out what was going on with their competitors. And so over a sushi lunch one day, a friend of mine who was in the cybersecurity industry said, look, he goes, dude, who better in the world to call and ask how a guy like you would hack into them than you? So why don't you just offer counter intel capabilities? Right. I was like, that's actually not a bad idea. So almost over the next like two and a half, 3 weeks, I sort of pivoted my whole firm from being a competitive intelligence company to being a counterintelligence company. And so this is the early 2000s. Cyber, or what was called InfoSec, was just kind of burgeoning. It was still an early nascent thing. Companies, if you ask someone about information security or whatever, people would probably talk about antiviruses at best, McAfee or Norton or Mantech, I think would probably be it. People, or firewalls, maybe that would be a word that people would know. But that was it. That was about it. And so little by little, I gained a pretty interesting customer base of organizations and mainly organizations at the time that wanted to make sure that their systems were up to snuff and able to be secured against threat actors. And that carried on for about 15 years. In that set of years, I built companies that actually built security and intelligence-based products and sold those companies off, which made me even more money because you're selling a whole organization that has intellectual property. And I still do that today. So I still build companies that build security or cybersecurity like products or intelligence-based products. But I've gone back to my roots now, and I actually do provide counterintelligence consulting, but more to family offices and ultra high net worth individuals, groups that have a lot to lose and that don't really understand what vectors of attack they may be subject to, or what kind of individuals or groups they might be find them interesting to attack. So I have a really interesting job where I have to think like the bad guys and advise my client and customers on what they're likely in for. So it's kind of a dream job.
I should get into that too, right? Like, didn't we mention that? Like,
yeah, you should.
You know, I don't know the cyber part of it enough.
Well, Matt, the cyber is just a speed issue. It's not the actual tactic. So what you did, you're an innovator, and I'm not trying to praise the crime part of your job or whatever. I'm praising the skill that you're able to manifest, and the way you think is actually an asset. And probably get into that.
I was going to say, even now, like, I mean, and I don't really have any knowledge on how things work, but I mean, I get stuff all the time from, let's say, Capital One Bank or Capital One credit card. Like, I have a couple Capital One credit cards. So I get them, they send it to me, and I never click on it. I never click on it. I think, well, I'll go to the app that's on my phone. You know what I'm saying? Or I'm not going to click on this thing because I don't know who this is. I don't know. It looks all right. Or anything that I question. I always go to I always end up going to to who sent it to me. Was it Capital One? Was it the bank? Was it this? Was it, and then suddenly it's a bunch of numbers and letters. It's like, okay, this is just some generated thing. And it's like, and I always tend to get, I tend to have a great spidey sense. I'm super big on intuition. I mean, I'm a big believer in intuition. So
well, you're right on. And well, this is what's interesting. Those threat actors and the sophisticated ones, everything from, the nation state groups, like before we got on the call, we talked about Lazarus, from North Korea. They thrive on duping people that are less discerning than you into doing things.
Right.
And they're looking to harvest everything from financial, means, getting people to pay up in crypto and all kinds of stuff and everything else. But I'd be curious about something. Did you get taught that, or did you naturally feel like you need to be more discerning and skeptical of what you're getting? Was that just in you naturally to do that?
I mean, obviously from just growing up, I think I've always been someone who's kind of thought, how does that work?
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't want to do it that way, how could I do it this? Like, I've always been very, I've always been very, I want to say smart. I always think of it as just being clever. I've always been super clever.
Creative.
And yeah, I'm very creative. I have a degree. My degree's in fine arts, so like I don't have a normal degree, and it always, and I remember my teachers were always explaining that, look, if an artist designed this, then an artist can figure out how to replicate it, or how to improve on, or how to do something along those lines. But I definitely think going to prison and meeting all of the various different types of criminals and hearing all the different types of scams, and that definitely spiked my intuition at the very least, because you very quickly question everything when someone approaches you. And I'm always very polite. I was raised by a strict Catholic woman who was, my mom was very, no matter what, you be polite. Doesn't matter. You can tell someone, no matter how you do it, you do it politely. And so I've always been very polite, but I can be very, very polite to you while internally thinking something's not right. That doesn't sound right. You would never know I'm questioning you. But yeah, I don't jump into anything right away. And my dad there was just tons of things that he would mention to me. Just, he worked for State Farm Insurance for like 50 years. He worked till he was 70 something. Was it 50 or 40? Probably 40 years. Yeah, 40, 45 years. But he was very big on questioning people, asking questions about things, making phone calls. He was like, nobody's ever going to not hire you because you called back 2 days later. And they said, oh, okay, we'll let you know. We'll give you a call within the week, and calling back 2 days later. It's like, they're not going to say, oh, you've called me twice and I told you I'd call you back. I'm not going to hire you. He's like, that's not going to happen. So, but yeah, there's just lots of things along those lines. But one of the things when you were talking about kind of like the, I don't know, I thought of corporate espionage. I remember I read a book called, and it was a novel. It was called Paranoia. I don't know if you ever read. It was great. It was about one company planting someone inside of another company to get into it. And the guy worked there for 6 months or a year and became like he slowly got up to become a, I don't know, some kind of vice president or something. But it was a great book, and it was all to try and get, corporate information.
And that's the evolution for me, because it started with getting information on a personal level, person to person. So social engineering and using those methods and tactics and collecting a little bit of information and then feeding it to another person that now is armed with that information, and then go meet that person in a what would seem like a serendipitous way to then get more information, because now you've got some commonality. And it was this sort of process to use a whole team to get this detail. And usually it did include, everything from people that might look like colleagues in the gym that were just jogging on the treadmill next to you, to beautiful women sitting at a bar that probably shouldn't be the right, you'd have to like find the right type of woman that might be appropriate fit for that guy. Because if it's a supermodel and he's not exactly the kind of guy to pull some woman like that, it would never work. But you get someone that like is on par with that person, then you've got armed her with information about some sort of trade show that he went to, and she can be like, oh, weren't you at so-and-so trade show 2 years ago? I think we ran into each other. And of course he's going to say yes. And so it was really interesting the way we would do that. The evolution of that for me was it just simply went from a human, or to use a government terminology, human intelligence gathering process, to a cyber, to signals intelligence ability to do it out there. So that's kind of where I landed. All these years later, it's sort of the same thing, just done electronically.
Do you know who Andrew Bustamante is?
God, that name sounds so familiar.
So he's a former, he is a former CIA, I want to say spy, he's a former CIA spy. And I interviewed him the other day, and he's one of the things he does is he does security. He did do security, but he also does, and keep in mind, he went under for, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 18 months, and he has a podcast called Everyday Spy, but he also does talks and he does workshops, and they're all kind of based on like things that spies do every day. Like, how do you become an everyday spy? Like, it seems hokey, but it actually is. He's an interesting guy. You've seen, he was on Lex Friedman. He was on he's huge, right? He's super interesting guy, but definitely somebody that maybe I was going to say, if you're talking about high net individuals, they would get a kick out of him. Like, he's very articulate, obviously smart, really interesting guy. But I was going to say, you know who Victor Lustig is?
No, I don't think so.
He's a scam artist. He is the guy that, I'm sure you've heard this. He sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap twice.
That's awesome.
And he had a set of rules that he lived by, that like how to, it was like, how do you con someone?
Right.
And one of the ways, a lot of people don't realize this, is that initially what he did was he rode or sailed cruise lines.
Interesting.
This is back prior to World War I. Right?
Wow.
So this is in the early teens, 19 in the teens. So he did this for years, back and forth. And one of the things they asked, he was asked later on in life was like, how did you? And he would scam people out of money. He had a very common story that he told people, and they always wanted to invest. And by the time he got off the boat, he had multiple people that wanted to invest in his place. He was in there weren't movies, so he was in production to make plays. He had very successful plays. He's on this cruise that's super expensive to be on. He meets he's now stuck with these high net individuals, like you said, and he tells them he's in a world that they think is very sexy. They've all been to plays. They're all doing the calculations on how much money these things make. And so he would, on the cruise, he would go to Europe and back, and every time he would get 2-3 people. It got so bad, he had to keep switching cruise lines because they would look for him. But once again, you don't have a photo of him. This is back in, like I said, the early teens. And he had a very basic set of rules. And they were like, you should look them up. They're great. It's basic, and they're so simple. It's like, don't talk. First of all, don't talk a lot. Yeah. Introduce a subject like religion. Whatever your mark says their religion is, you be that religion. If you no matter what they said, you'd never be disagreeable. You always agree. You always wait for them to hint at their political beliefs, and you agree and you support those political beliefs. Right. He had a whole series of and there were nothing. but it was
Yeah.
just being agreeable.
Yeah. Well, it's identification. People all of a sudden feel like you're in, birds of a feather flock together, as they say, right?
Right.
And if you have the means to sort of predict what they want to hear based on what they've said, you win. I couldn't agree more. That's brilliant. No, I mean, that's really cool, especially from the era that he's coming from, because, and what's so funny is that, we get wrapped up in the cyber thing, that it's super technical, right? People, yeah, it is. But it's back to common sense. It's back to common sense. It's that you don't want to create this elaborate text message if you're trying to scam someone through a cell phone,
right?
And get people, like, oh, well, that's not real. This is why things like the AI stuff's scary, because it's starting to make it simple again. It's starting to reduce it down to something that sounds cute, natural language like. And
right.
Back to common sense, 100%. Yeah, it's crazy.
I had watched a few videos with the Lazarus Group, and I guess that the amount of the Bitcoin that they'd stolen, and they couldn't quite track the, they can track the Bitcoin, but they, because they can only launder it through these exchanges, they ended up recovering something like, forget what it was, 260 million or something out of 300 million, or and it was like, wow, they got that money back. Well, they still ended up with like 40 something or close to $40 million. And I was like, that's a nice lick. So yeah. I was thinking, I mean, if your fallback position is 40 million, wow. Not that those guys saw any of that. I mean, it's all, from my understanding, well, it's all state, sponsored.
Well, that's interesting, and we'll get into this if you're interested. I just had this conversation 5 minutes before I jumped on the show with you, that people still bifurcate nation state with threat actors that are independent or criminals or whatever, cyber criminals, and they're actually very overlapping. So a lot of nation state skilled actors, like out of Russia or whatever, or China or North Korea, they're moonlighting as cyber criminals doing this kind of stuff because they have the skills.
Right. Well, I mean,
they've got resources.
I can see that in China. I definitely see it in Russia, but I mean, in North Korea, I mean, you're not accessing must be very difficult to access the internet, if that's possible at all. So, I mean, these are guys that it's been proven that they're working for the North Koreans just to generate money for the regime.
Right.
So, which to me, it's funny too, because unfortunately the whole time I'm watching the program on the Lazarus Group, and so for like, well, can you basically give like a minute or two explanation of what happened with that?
Well, so there's the one thing
watching.
Just to be clear, the specific incident you're talking about is one of many. So this group's still active. So there's no shutting down of them, so to speak.
Oh yeah, it's billions. Yeah, we're talking about they track back billions.
Huge. And what's interesting is that, and just for context, and I don't know how you want to kind of drive toward getting into this conversation. We're kind of in it already, which is interesting. The size of these polls, as you put it, or licks, as a good word for it, are massive. I mean, they absolutely dwarf anything else that's kind of physically done, where you're going into one location. It's just unbelievable. What's really interesting, and where I'm hoping we'll land in the conversation, is around the ransomware operators that dwarf the Lazarus stuff too. But by the way, just Lazarus for context to your viewership, that this is a North Korean sponsored, we'll call it, group, at least the best of our abilities from an attribution standpoint. Attribution is really hard when it comes to the internet stuff. You don't always know who's really behind it. A lot of what you do technically is look for similarities in how some of the code's written, maybe the tactics they're using to deploy the what we'll call implants, right, which is malware. That usually is a pretty good giveaway on who's doing it. There's a wrench in the system now, Matthew, which is that now with things like the AI tools that we have, like ChatGPT and all that, you can make your code look like it was written by someone else entirely, and it'll send law enforcement on a completely different scent than who you are. So this attribution portion of the process has gotten to be very difficult. It's always been hard. It's even harder now, I guess is the best way to put it. But you're right. Back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, there was a very big crypto scamming aspect to their operation, but that was sort of the smallest part of what they're really up to, which is information stealing, other types of financial theft. This was a good smokescreen in a lot of ways for everything else that they're up to. And they're all learning from each other too as we get into the conversation. There's massive syndicates of these guys, and they have different sort of roles and responsibilities. Some are access brokers. They just simply get you access to what you want. Then they affiliatize the access to others to get in that are a little more cavalier. Sometimes they'll broker access to people that are bulls in a china shop and make a mess of things so that it'll send everyone off on a wild goose chase to chase the affiliate that got in, but not the actual access broker. So I'm getting into the weeds here, and I'm happy to define some of those concepts. But
yeah, what's the access broker? You mean someone who like is working for the company?
No, access brokerage in the world of cyber or nation state sort of cyber activities has to do with in human terms, it's the person with the key to the vault of the bank. They give it out so people can go and do what they want to do in the vault. They don't actually go in themselves. They simply get paid for the access to it. And they're the ones that build the more sophisticated methods to get in to an environment electronically. And then what we call maintain persistence. So they'll not only open the door, but then they'll leave something in there that keeps the door open. They'll wedge it open with something so that then they can broker that access to that environment to a bunch of people. So this is what makes this very difficult, is that it's not as clean cut as people might think. It's not like hacker A goes and hacks and steals and does all this and then leaves. Today, it's a gigantic, organized business situation where there's the people that will get access to the environments, then they'll broker the access out on the dark web to the highest bidders or people that are lined up to sort of buy the access.
How is that? I understand. So how does that person get that access? Like, for instance, I was watching one program that's talking about this was all kind of North Korea.
Sure.
But it was that apparently there's like an entire, section or division in North Korea for hackers or sometimes it's espionage based also, where they'll have some guy a North Korean who's highly talented get a job working, programming or doing whatever. And he'll work there for 6 months or a year, however long it is, and become a valued employee. And the bank, some bank or financial institution or whatever it may be, is in the UK or whatever, somewhere in Europe, or maybe it's in the United States. And they love this employee. They think he's great. They don't realize he's in North Korea. They think maybe he's, who knows where they think he is, Malaysia, wherever. And so they work with him and they think he's great. And then eventually he gets to a point where he's gained access to their system. And that's really his goal. And he's getting a paycheck. Like if he makes 150 or 200,000 a year, like that money goes into the North Korean coffers, and he gets his $15,000 a year, which is still good money. And he's allowed to, of course, work this job and then garner information, or maybe put himself in a position where he can steal money or give someone access. So that's why I thought when you meant an access broker, someone who's in the system.
Yeah, that's absolutely a version of it. It's the slow, long-term kind of covert deployment of a real person to social engineer their way in and do that, right? Absolutely, 100%. What's more alarming is that you can do that exact thing with malware, spread out, like shotgun approach to thousands of organizations. Get that malware in there that starts to laterally move, and it's called blast radius. It lands on an HR lady's computer. Let's call it Martha's computer, who runs HR in company X. She opens emails up and reads resumes every day. It's her job. You weaponize one of those resumes, And that resume gets opened by her to read it. It opens, it's a real resume, but alongside that resume being opened is a piece of malware that gets deployed on her computer. And then what it does is it looks for every other computer connected to hers, and it laterally moves and spreads itself out to the organization. And not only does it do that, it reports back to its owner about where it is, what it's found, and everything else, just like the guy you're talking about, but done in an electronic fashion. It's very streamlined, very efficient. And then multiply that times thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of computers, times thousands of companies. You've got a really, really powerful intelligence collection capability to then figure out who you're going to go and attack.
Is that how the Lazarus Group got access to that? Basically, it was like $300 million worth of Bitcoin. The one of the cases that I had seen, and they moved it like overnight. Within like a week, there was like something like the Chinese holiday or something, and like they had like 5 or 6 days that they were able to do this. And even when it was detected, they couldn't they couldn't get a hold of anybody because all the banks were. It was a holiday.
Yep. All that was planned. All that was by design. So it's just like good old school art of war, Matthew, where wait for a moonless night to do your attack. Same thing. I mean, it's funny how history repeats itself when it comes to like military strategy or espionage tactics or tradecraft. They're always the same strategies, which is catch people off guard, wait till there's some sort of political holiday or national holiday to get people when there's a skeleton crew on staff where they really can't respond. And things like with crypto, just really quick, just to address that piece of it, ironically, it was Bitcoin, right? Which is something that now has proven to be quite traceable. Like if you've got the right utilities and tools and talent, you can figure out where things are going. But there's so many cryptocurrencies that are not traceable like that. They have really true anonymity. And had they decided to simply shift the currency into a more anonymous altcoin or whatever you want to call it, they could have gone aground and there was no retrieving anything. So it's kind of interesting that, and this is old, right? This is not a recent situation. So these days they've gotten a little smarter about hiding their tracks.
Well, they did switch a portion, portions of it. They could only switch, so much. And they knew they were being tracked. The problem is they had to go through an exchange. In order to launder it, they had to go through an exchange, which this is what killed me is that it's like, okay, you have to go through an exchange to convert this to actual cash and get it into, and they're trying to make it obviously, completely anonymous, but it's being tracked thus far. It was being tracked. And eventually they ended up moving like 80% of it to an exchange that was extremely credible. And, they opt for, when I watched this, they were like, we have no idea why they thought that this exchange would do this for them. Does that make sense? Like they were like typically they'll go to a questionable exchange that doesn't ask a lot of questions. And they were like, so our fear, but you can only move so much through that. And they said, for some reason they moved it here and we just contacted them and they froze the money. And they were like, so they got lucky and they did it getting 40 million. What I didn't understand was, it was all, I don't know, it's North Korea. I kept thinking like, why wouldn't you have already gone somewhere in Europe? And, you could steal identities, get passports, go to Europe, establish accounts that would allow you to move that money very quickly. And it would have become anonymous. Like you can wire it into whatever, 40 or 50 or 100 different banks and then wire it again. Yeah. And you only need a fake identity to do that or steal someone's real identity. 10 people's real identities, multiple corporations, multiple bank accounts. Now, it may take some time, but at least the people that were tracking the Bitcoin would have been lost at that point. At that point, they would have been like, okay, this was just converted to cash and placed in several Romanian banks, and now it's been, and people are cashing it out. People are moving it to different corporate accounts. People are moving it throughout Europe. Now we've got a problem, but for some reason we just.
Well, it's interesting, Matthew. So 2 things. One, in my entire career, the way we've generally caught people, especially from a cyber perspective, is some failure along the way where they've forgotten to cover something up, or they've misstepped in an area where they thought they were being a little overzealous. Like if I were to speculate, and this is purely speculation about why they maybe went to a very legitimate exchange, was to hide in plain sight, right? To have something there, because it's well known that these less savory exchanges maybe couldn't handle the volume, perhaps, and are imminently under the watch of the Interpol or FBI or others, right? So it's almost like, let's go where they're not going to necessarily look or expect us to go. Of course, the controls that were in place did catch it, and they lost out big. The other half of this is that it's an interesting concept, because you're talking about the final stages of the exfil of the money. No matter how sophisticated they might be, this is still a fairly new thing, meaning crypto and using it as a utility for massive harvesting of money and all that. It's still kind of new. So, we're kind of judging the op from the armchair. You've probably heard that term before, where we're sort of saying, well, obviously they should have gone here. And it's like, but you'd be surprised how many times people that are really sophisticated screw up. I mean, for example, some of the more nation state groups that I chase around, the ones that are government funded and have the means, they don't cover their tracks in any way when they're doing kind of the setup of their infrastructure sometimes completely. They just leave it wide open, because they make the assumption that no one's ever going to go dig there. Right. They assume that we're going to track the movement of the data, or we're going to track the movement of the crypto, which is indeed what normally happens. No one looks at the infrastructure, so therefore let's not worry about it. And they learn from the pain of failing there. So you can bet your bottom dollar those guys will probably never use a very good, trustworthy exchange again.
Right.
Because it may have been a miscalculation. It may have been something where they thought that this was going to be the best place to keep something that was never going to be tangled with, because it looks truly legit.
They still made 40 million failure. Like, I'm ready to let me fail. Like that's a hell of a failure. That's an amazing part. But you're right. I always, I'll interview these guys that, have been in prison and the running scams. And it's always something like, you did, you got the fake IDs, you got the credit cards, you got the passports, you set up the corporations, you opened the bank accounts, you had people in between you and them. Nobody knew your location. You had all these drop phones. You had all of this. You did this, like all of these things. And then you went and rented a room using a stolen credit card. Like, you have $500,000 in the bank account, a couple $100,000 in cash, and you're in the middle of running a multi-million-dollar scam, and you used a stolen credit card for $1,000 hotel room bill.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, like 100%. It's the old.
Yeah,
it's Al Capone's tax records story, right? The famous one. It's the tail light out on the car in the getaway that gets it pulled over, because they're. I
use that all the time. I always say, listen, I'm not one of these guys that's going to be driving around with a stolen car and a broken taillight and a body in the trunk. Like, that's not me. I'm crossing all my T's, dotting all my I's.
Yep.
But I'm pretty patient. So
that's a key thing, right? The genius is it's the obsessive compulsiveness that separates the men from the boys in that space, even in cyber. And I think it would probably be very similar in your world, which is that the ones that are meticulous usually win, because they're really, really obsessive about perfection, and they're really big on making sure that the op is clean from the start. And there's this, it's an art form, again, back to that concept. I'm not trying to praise it per se. I mean, but you have to appreciate the sophistication of some of these groups that are perfect with their zero residual presence of things, or how they're able to completely eradicate anything. It's pretty amazing.
Well,
and it takes a lot of effort.
I think everything is kind of like that, though. Look at like Steve Jobs is like, this amazing visionary.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible interpersonal relationships. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Horrendous. It's like same thing. You look at someone like, CEOs or presidents, just complete narcissists that make their way all the way up the chain. But the fact is that, well, if he wasn't a narcissist, he would have never made it up the chain.
Right on.
And what makes some CEOs amazing CEOs or entrepreneurs are the same things that make them detrimental to be around.
Very much
You know
so.
what I'm saying? It's the same thing with like committing, any type of crime, like they, or in the criminal world, like, these guys, like, you're taking all these painstaking precautions, and then you make one little slip up because you think I've done such an amazing job here that nobody's going to catch that.
Yeah. And Matthew, you're right. I mean, look, victim of your own success is real in this space, especially with the volumes of money we're talking about. It's not just one bank heist. It's effectively thousands of bank heists all at once, right? And here's an interesting thing. I mean, you start looking at some of the really, really sophisticated, Caucasus region or Balkan, maybe, Russian-esque groups, and you saw the pictures of them sitting in Saint-Tropez on these massive yachts with like a freaking ocelot, right? It's
Right.
like you're going to get caught doing that. There's no discretion after a while. There's a megalomaniac quality that kicks in with the ones that are a little less than disciplined and have the means to kind of win on a perpetual basis. It's kind of like I was telling a friend the other day about watching world tour poker or world championship poker games, and it's always the same people that seem to end up at the last rounds of these things.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. It's because they're very disciplined. They're playing without an emotional tie to it. No, it's not luck at all. It's not luck.
Yeah, when you were mentioning, like, I know I saw this one about this Russian hacking group that had stolen, I forget how much cryptocurrency they'd stolen. I mean, it was outrageous. And they're, because they're in Russia, they're on social media, they're driving these Audi, that I forget what the Audi A is, it R8 sports car, doing donuts. They're driving Ferraris. They're talking, they're holding up stacks of money. They're, look at us, look at it. And it's just like, wow, you're like, you better never leave Russia. Like, you're going to, they end up going somewhere where they think, we're going to pop into this country right here. Nobody's paying attention. No, countries are patient. They throw an indictment and a red notice out there and just wait.
Yeah, well, this is the thing that's funny is that you talk about among the criminal underground from a cyber perspective, they look at the law enforcement groups as slow and plodding and not that sharp, and they're not going to hire the best talent ever because it's government. It's the same story, right? I think it holds true across all forms of, whether it's kinetic or cyber or whatever. The problem is, you nailed it. You said exactly what I say all the time, is that they have all the time and the money in the world. They're in no rush either.
That's what I was just thinking. Yeah, but they have an inexhaustible budget, manpower, and time.
Yes.
So
you're always looking over your shoulder. You're constantly running. So in some ways, I think that psychology is what gets to these guys a bit. I think they're kind of like, well, the time will come and I won't be able to enjoy some of this. They sort of throw caution to the wind and they get a little wild and crazy with their success. I mean, it's crazy. But then there are these others that are very methodical, like the ransomware operators, and they've made out billions worth of winnings out of this stuff, not millions anymore. And the scary part is now they're figuring out how to refine that process, Matthew, where they're going to go after groups that are otherwise not normally targeted. They'll go after the average individual or someone that can pay them $5,000. It used to be go after big companies, get something on the inside of the network to encrypt everything and then hold them hostage and say, I'll give you the key if you pay me X amount of money, right? That's the classic ransomware scheme, which was very successful, and they made a ton of money. And they even got it working where they knew a company had cyber insurance, and they would actually intentionally hack that organization knowing that they had a policy that would cover it. So they had a really clean plan for saying, here's our premium list of what we're going to hack into. Here's our less than premium. Here's our we'll net them. And if we get them, great. If not, who cares? Because they're not actually the ones we know are going to pay. So they figured out the situation here, which is it's frankly the same thing as any kind of fraud in terms of insurance fraud. If you know that there's going to be a payout, you do things in the exact way that you know that the claim can be made and the money will be paid. And what's ironic is that you look at the stats online for ransomware over the last, 4 years, pre-pandemic through the pandemic to now. I mean, Matthew, you're talking about a fraction of what's been reported. I mean, really, like, or that of what is reported. Like the rest that's happened, no one's ever said anything about. It's all brushed under the carpet. So I think that the vast majority of organizations have probably had a brush with it and paid and not told anyone about it. Yeah.
What was it? The Sands Casino? Which casino was it?
Mm.
And that was in Vegas, and wasn't that a Russian based? Was it Russian based?
The Sands was Iranian, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. But you're talking another situation that's not even 2.5, 3 weeks ago. MGM was in the news.
Oh, that's right. I was going to say MGM that's the one I thought was Russian, because that was recent.
Yeah, that's likely, at least from an attribution with the people I've talked to, it seems like it was probably Russian in origin. Correct.
But they first hit another casino in Vegas a week or so beforehand, and they paid.
Yeah.
And that's what I had heard.
Yeah. And get this. This is what's really interesting. There's a high likelihood that what it's called island hopping. It's like a military term they've commandeered for cyber, which is nice. If I want to get to Matthew, I'm going to go get his
World War II, Pacific War. I love World War II.
That's exactly what it is. Totally, man. So if I want to get to Matthew, I know he's really good at security, but his neighbor is not. And he has really close ties with his neighbor. In fact, Matthew lets his neighbor in the house every now and then if they need like something when he's not at home. And so they have a key. So if I go hack into the neighbor, I'll get into Matthew through a weak point of his operational security, which is his partner or his third-party partner or his customer or something like that. So what's fascinating about this is that now in the world that we're in today, everything's so interconnected. There's no way to really know whether you're buttoned up or not. You might have all of it, but that doesn't mean all the partners that you work with that are usually smaller and less capable have it all buttoned up, and they have direct connectivity into your environment. So it's a one-way ticket inward if you get into these smaller groups that are all the supply. It's like the Target hack, the most famous one, probably one of the most famous hacks ever. TJ Maxx and Target, from a cyber perspective, those are like legendary hacks, right? Because the threat actor in Target got into Target's main network by hacking into the HVAC system access. Literally the air conditioner system vendor had access to the main network, and they got into those guys, and then they bounced right through. They essentially daisy chained themselves into the main network at Target. So this is something that's commonplace now, and so it's becoming almost a whack-a-mole problem for the law enforcement groups to go chase around, because you can't secure everything. You can't build a big enough, tall enough wall to secure everything. What you have to do is now build things that become a deterrent for the threat actor to come after you. You have to become a pain in the ass to hack, right? And let them move on to lower hanging fruit rather than trying to assume you're going to build something that's impenetrable.
I was going to say, whenever I'll talk with people about, about fraud, and I do these talks, you tend to get the same questions over and over again, and one of those questions is always like, well, how can we stop this from happening? Mm-hmm. And the problem is they always think that I'm going to be able to say, oh, well, you have to do this. First, I'll be like, well, is this, are you able to stop this? Yeah, absolutely. You can stop it. It can be stopped. Fraud can be stopped. Here's the problem. You now make it, but to do that, you have to make it so difficult. You've eliminated normal people from obtaining loans. So it's like there's that balance. How do you still make the system manageable and usable and friendly enough to allow people to apply for loans and get loans, and also eliminate as much fraud? It's a balancing. Like, you can eliminate it if you want to go and make every phone call and check and order all those documents. If you want to dump $1,500, if you want to change underwriting from being a $250 expense and turn it into a $2,000 expense or $3,000 expense, you can do that. But when they start doing the numbers, it's like, okay, well, now it's not worth doing the loan. We lose 100% more money on allowing the fraud to go through. Right.
So it's so funny. This is great. So I have this story I used to tell. Well, not a story, this concept that if you want to do ultimate security, I don't care if it's physical security or cyber, same concept, right? Ultimate security is no windows, no doors, no light, no life. It's over. Because if you lock it up to the point where it actually is truly quote unquote secure, it's just not functional, to your point, just to kind of extra double down on what you're saying, because you're completely correct. But then there's another aspect here. So yes, it's all about risk tolerance and management, right? Mainly with these companies, whether it's a physical level of tolerance, because if you make it look like Fort Knox, it might deter folks that you've talked to in your, in the past that would be like, oh, forget that one. But it's also going to deter the customer base. It feels too imposing. It feels too intimidating. And you're right, you lose business. And if it becomes too slow, because everything is slowed down to a crawl so it can be observed, nobody wants to work with those types of organizations. They're too painful to kind of interact with. This is where the government has such a challenge, because they have all these layers and it makes it incredibly difficult to kind of negotiate anything with them. But then there's another aspect here that's interesting, and this has more to do with, it's both, it's cyber and physical, is compliance has gotten in the world in the way too now. So what's really interesting is that in an attempt to get organizations to comply with having a level of security that's good, federal regulations have imposed a set of compliance standards. The thing is, Matthew, most of the time, the penalty for not being in compliance is lower than the amount you'd pay for security. So they just pay the fine. They don't bother deploying all that and getting the hassle of buying all this crap that they don't know how to deploy or need a team to run. They'll be like, it's a fine of $2 million when it would actually cost us 3.5 or 4 to really buy everything that would put us in compliance. Just pay the fine. Yeah, and so that's kind of where it is now.
I was watching some series the other day where it was for pain management, and there was a company and the company, they were like, you know what a speaker program is? So they were running a speaker program where they can't pay the doctors to prescribe medication, but if you prescribe for this much medication, we'll put you on our speaker program and you'll get whatever, $4,500, and you come and give a speech at this little convention and you make this much, whatever. So they're paying them, it's a workaround. So they were talking about the speaker program, and then they were talking about going off brand, like saying, we're going to start pushing these doctors to prescribe this, not for cancer, which it was designed for cancer. And we've been pushing cancer. Now we're going to tell them they can also prescribe it for other types of pain. And they were like, listen, that's going to come back on us. And they sat there and their actuaries in the boardroom doing the numbers. And he's like, okay, well, we're looking at a profit of $1 billion and a fine at maximum, at the max, the fine's $500 million. We just made $500 million. Yeah. Like that's the worst case scenario, is we make $500 million. Best case is if they catch us at all, it's a $200 million fine, and we made $800 million. Like, you know what I mean? It was like, wow, like it's totally worth it to do that. And in so many cases, it is.
It really is. And then, that kind of dovetails into another aspect around using the technology to your advantage in ways that is quite clever. So usually people think of hackers and they think they're stealing either information or intellectual property or money or crypto, right? One and the same. It's usually that's what people think. They think that there's a hooded kid or whatever somewhere in a basement. It's the usual visual that Hollywood's created, right? Yeah. While there's elements of there's elements of that, script kiddies or skiddies, we'll call them, that do this kind of stuff. It's fine. They're playing around and they're learning. It's not fine, but you know what I mean? They're not the threat. The real threat, and this is extremely clever, is market manipulation with hacking. And what I mean by that is they're going and they're hacking into large public organizations. We're talking about these very well organized groups, and they'll deploy malware that is intended to get caught, Matthew. Like, it's not meant to hide that long. It's meant to sort of stay like a little ticking time bomb. until such time that it makes sense for it to sort of show itself. And then magically the press gets an anonymous tip that so-and-so public organization's hacked. You might want to go check on it, report on it. And what they've done in that timeline is they've bought short positions in the stock price so that when it does get hacked, they make an incredible amount of money on the plummet, and then they make money on the correction on the way back up. It's incredible.
So, it's funny you saying that. I specifically was talking to my buddy Pete, because the guy that I told you was like, "Oh, you gotta check out this. You gotta ask him this. Ask him about this." And I was thinking to myself, like, I wonder why they don't buy up the stock and short sell it, and create these situations. If they can't move the crypto, or if they can't move the Bitcoin, then why not go ahead and buy up as much of the company and take short positions? And I was actually we talked about that, and he was like, "You should mention that." So that is insane. It's funny. There was something else when you were talking. I wanted to mention. There was this. I want to say it was called like Solar Sale or something. It was like they were
SolarWinds,
and it's what they're the big solar generators.
Oh, different. Okay, no. So it could be two different things then. So SolarWinds is an IT firm that got hacked, and in the way the hackers did it was they actually implanted a malicious code into one of the updates that this company sent out to their entire constituency of users, which is a really advanced way of getting yourself embedded, right? They didn't deploy their own malware as like a separate kind of thing. They actually baked in the compromise into an update that went out legitimately by the company. Is that what you're talking about, SolarWinds?
Yeah. I think I was thinking about two different things. I know that in China, there was also an American company that was doing the windmills, the solar or the and they actually, and this was an intellectual property theft from China, where they had stolen a bunch of the software. But anyway, you were saying for
that one is just kind of the poster child for supply chain hacking, the best way to put it.
Wasn't that a Russian company?
Well, SolarWinds is an American company, but it was believed to be a Russian actor behind the hack, right? And then so in one go, like the way they were able to sort of scoop up a ton, they got into about 30,000 different organizations all in one go. So, and they had access to these.
And so what are they taking from those organizations? Is this just...
So, well, it depends, because I think this is where this is the weird, murky area between where geopolitical motivations that drive these more sophisticated government-run groups bleeds into the cyber criminals that are all financially motivated. And sometimes those governmental groups that have political motivations to destabilize or create influence campaigns. We're getting into something much deeper and not quite per se true crime per your show, but I think it is a massive, massive operation that uses things like criminal activity to their advantage. It's almost like proxy militia, right? Think of it that way. When you have a hacker that's out there wreaking havoc by stealing millions of dollars in crypto or shorting stock, I mean, what an incredible misdirection utility for a nation state actor to leverage. I mean, look, there's been no shortage in history. Back to our history lesson for the third one of this particular episode. But Air America program, where they were moving drugs into the U.S. I mean, that's an operation facilitating criminal activities on the streets to facilitate an agenda for a slush fund. I mean, there's all these stories that are very, very much akin to what we're talking about here. But anyway, we're getting into some big nuances. But yeah, SolarWinds was a really interesting one because it set the standard for how you could go and hack into one place and get into many. And yes, there is information or intellectual property theft. There's PII, which is personally identifiable information like social security numbers, birthdays, names, everything that you would have had a blast with in your past life, getting a hold of it, because it would have given you a treasure trove of an unlimited supply of identities that you could leverage. So if you think about the force multiplication of technology, Matthew, they're doing nothing different than what you created, pioneered, came up with when you were doing what you were doing. It's just done at a scale and a speed and a cadence and a frequency that's unprecedented. That's the difference.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you were talking more about the, the organizations that are backed by nations, it's like, it's like a, it's like a cyber war, right? Like, like we're spying on them, they're spying on us. But in the end, I always wonder, like, let's say you've got North Korea, or you've got China, or you've got, Russia, and the Justice Department will come out with these. I see, and I remember watching something. This was actually, I think, when I was like in prison. It was like 10 years ago, and they had indicted a bunch of people in North Korea or China, I forget which one, and they actually had tracked them back to where they knew where they worked. They knew the name of the department. They knew who was working in that department. They said, because we can watch them go all the way. We know when they show up, within 20 minutes, there's a spike in activity. Like, we know when this guy works. Like, there's a whole thing. And they had indicted multiple nationals. But in the end, like, how do you prosecute those guys? How do you, you're never going to get your hands on them. Every once in a while. Now, I know that I was locked up with a bunch of they weren't hackers, right? Because I've really only been locked up with one or two guys that were ever charged with like hacking. So, but I was charged with guys that were running, like dark web forums, credit card forum. I always say credit card forums, but they do other stuff. They sell counterfeit credit cards. They sell dumps of information. You know what a dump is. They sell dumps. They sell fulls. They sell, and then sometimes they have these tutorials on just how to run PayPal scams. Just a very different scams that they got 45-minute video on how to scam PayPal out of X amount of dollars, or different scams you can run. So I would say credit card forums, but they do other stuff. So
sure.
The point is that I was locked up with a bunch of these guys, and everybody would call them hackers, but they weren't hackers. But and several of these guys were Russian or from Ukraine, and they had got some of them, and one or two of them were actually Russian, and they only ended up getting this one guy because, like, Russia wouldn't hand him over. He just happened to decide to go on vacation just outside of Russia. Like I don't know what he was thinking. Like, I'm 150 miles away, from the border or something. Like, I don't know what you're thinking. Like, he went into Russia, and they notified the FBI that he had entered. I forget what country was it. I'm going to say it was Moldova. It was like, I forget. Anyways, one of these little countries, probably one of these, one of the Baltic or the Eastern European bloc countries that used to be. And he happened to go there on a vacation, like a skiing vacation or something. I forget what it was. And sure enough, he wasn't there more than like 3 days, and the FBI flies in and they arrest him, and they throw him on a plane. And, next thing you know, he's landing in New York, and he's screaming the whole time, "You're kidnapping me." And anyway, he ended up, it's so funny too, because he ended up getting, I still want to say he barely got any time. Like some of these guys, they're giving out outrageous time, 15 years, 20 years. This guy got, like, I don't know if it was 5 or 6 or 7 years for the amount of money he had stolen. It was not that much time. And I always noticed that a lot of the international criminals tend to get less time than the U.S. would give one of their own citizens. It's not always the case. There's always an exception. But
therein lies the frailty of the system as it relates to international laws, especially with cyber, right? Because
like, how do you get a hold of the guy?
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, in the beginning of the show, we talked about how attribution is difficult, right? It's very hard to sort of fingerprint an individual sometimes. You might know where the machine might be, or a general sense of where the IP address is coming out of, but it's still a far. It's still a million miles from the individual behind it sometimes, right? I was speaking to a colleague the other day that it was fascinating. He was hugely involved in the Zeus botnet takedown. Zeus is a banking Trojan. It's specifically there to harvest banking credentials, and then they would run these whole teams to log in using those credentials and then move money. Literally, just you're in the person's account. You can send it wherever you want. You can add an account. You can do all kinds of stuff. And they would do all kinds of stuff like grab the 2-factor authentication code from the cell phone by conning people into giving them the code, where they would actually get the malware to do that and harvest the information from the phone. I mean, it was incredibly sophisticated stuff. But all that to tell you that it took exactly what you're talking about. It took them getting the individuals on video, going into the banks, doing the actual transaction where they could correlate the timestamp of the video with the individual that was facially recognized, or at least now they can do that kind of thing, with the transaction happening at the teller window to then get the guy. But even with that, if the person did it at one bank and then zipped off somewhere else, or had a hoodie on, or my gosh, think about COVID with the mask situation. It's like, how are you going to even forget it? It's over. So you're right. It's
even if you get an indictment, how do you get the guy? Like, China's not handing over, Russia's not handing over a national.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing about this is that, back to kind of get to the theme of this particular episode, I mean, honestly, Matthew, most of these guys feel like it's a victimless crime. Like, no one gets hurt. There's no violence, at least from the perspective of a lot of these guys. It's completely passive. The money is going to get paid back somehow by some group. It's not victimless. Honestly, it isn't. But from the perspective of the threat actor, they're like, look, nobody got hurt. It was a painless way to get a lot of money. Like you said, if a failure is $40 million, come on.
Yeah,
it's hard.
So you don't have to,
it's not hard
to sell
to
me. You don't have to sell me on. No. I mean,
yeah.
Oh yeah. Listen, like I one of the reasons like my dollar amount isn't that high is because I was cautious.
Right.
I like to me, if I was thinking, okay, so you're telling me that right now nobody's gonna, like, as long as I don't leave Florida, you're telling me you will allow me to run a scam in Georgia, but you will not extradite me to Georgia, and I just have to never go to Georgia again. I'm good. Like, I'll go sit in the Starbucks. Because my crime now, just because of technology, think about it. I used to have to make my own W-2s and pay stubs. Now you can just go to, paystubs.com. They'll make your W-2s and pay stubs. They'll calculate everything so it's perfect per state, like the whole thing. I used to have to make my own bank statements. I used to have to make my own, I would design my own bank websites. I would make my own, I had to figure out how to get the software to make my own appraisals. I had to buy a house. Like, now I could, and then you had to actually physically go into the DMV, get them to issue me a driver's license in the name of someone who doesn't exist, or maybe someone who does exist. Maybe it's a stolen identity. I had to, so I then have to create this entire, legend that isn't real to support my person to borrow money. And then I actually have to go into physically go into downtown to public records. And then I also have to go to a closing. I have to go into banks and open bank accounts. Now you can sit in a Starbucks. I can make my pay stubs through a website. You pay a few bucks. You make pay stubs and W-2s. You can open your corporation online. You can open up the bank accounts online. You can rent an Airbnb. You can have it appraised. They never have to see me. I can schedule a closing, and I can close on my loans and property and loans all remotely, sitting in a Starbucks, and then wire the money wherever you want to wire it. And the interesting thing about that is everybody involved in that transaction now doesn't have to know what's going on. They don't have to know a scam's going on because they're just doing what they do on a regular basis.
Yep.
Tons of closings are done remotely. Tons of bank accounts are opened online. Tons of, all of these things. Appraisers show up. They never meet the owner. You rent Airbnbs. You never see the tenant. All of these things happen on a daily basis with no interaction. So if some guy sends you an email or you get a phone call or a text and they transfer the money, you get the money, then you're like, yeah, of course, sure, I'll mail you the key or I'll put it under the mat. Or so, and if you said, hey, Matt, you could do that, it's just all that has to take place in Georgia. And if you're ever indicted, don't worry, we will not allow them to extradite you from Florida. Like I don't have to leave Florida. If I have to vacation in Florida the rest of my life, it's not going to kill me. And so that's why I'm saying, like the North Koreans and stuff, like
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, think about like the some of the lesser fortunate areas of the world that where there's the average poverty line is way lower than ours. And
Nigeria,
guys, some of them, the
Nigerian
exactly.
scam,
Nigeria's a good example. Totally, the Slovenians and that whole group of guys and gals that do it, they're crazy talented.
I was going to say they're very sophisticated, very sophisticated.
Yes, right. And that's a living for them. Like this is the thing that's really, and it's not advocating for it. Obviously, like on this show, I'm sure you have plenty of people that talk about it. Like this is the best thing it's the sliced bread to do. It always comes back to the fact that that's a hard life looking over your shoulder. But for people that live in a state of effectively fear and probably risk of what could happen to them in their home countries, that would be probably worse than any prison here in the US.
Yeah.
They don't care. There's no compunction to do what they're doing because it's just way more motivating to see the kind of money they can make. Like you said, sitting in some internet cafe, they may not have a Starbucks, but they certainly have something that's equivalent to that has anonymity all over the place for them. They understand how to use technology better than the average person does here. And now with the advent of these tools to speak very fluently, like whether it's even text-based like an email or an SMS message, or now unbelievably audio with AI, well, you can sound like me and I can sound like you today. I could be an avatar that you're talking to right now. I'm not even real.
I joined, I subscribed. I think you subscribe for like a month for like $1. And for this website, and I dumped a 10-minute video of me, and then I dumped an article from Wired that I downloaded called "The Art of the Steal," just to see what it would sound like.
Yeah,
it had me. I just read it literally. It's like 40. I'm going to say it was 40 minutes of me reading a Wired article.
Yeah,
and it's listen, everybody that I sent it to. Even my wife was here walking through the kitchen when I was playing with it. And I said, how does that sound? She goes, what do you mean? I went, how's that sound? That's, I just generated that. She's, you didn't just read that? I was like, no, and I was like, yeah, and I played it. She was like, that is insane. If you listen to it, it's perfect. It pronounced one or two words incorrectly, and there's a feature you can click on to have it say it a couple of times. You're like, oh, that's the one I want. That's the correct pronunciation. It's amazing. So I had a guy on I was talking to the other day. We were talking about Facebook. Do you remember this scam, which is still, I'm sure probably used?
Mm-hmm.
Someone builds a fake Facebook page. So they use your picture, the whole thing. They take a bunch of your friends, they subscribe, they follow, whatever. So, a cursory look at it looks like, oh, it's you. And then they contact you through Messenger. They would text you through Messenger before and say, oh my gosh, Karim, I'm in Budapest right now. This actually happened to my mother several times. They would say, I'm in Budapest right now. My wallet was stolen. I have no money. Can you please Western Union me $1,000? I'll be back in Florida next week. I'll pay you back. I am so sorry. I've lost my passport. I'm just in a desperate situation.
Yeah.
My mom was almost going to pay. Like she was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Carol is in boot. Oh, I can't believe this. I had no idea she was even going. Like she's ready to try and she's trying to figure out how to Western Union money to Budapest. And if she hadn't asked my sister, that woman would have got the money. Now, what would have happened if Carol actually called her? If there was any question before, if my buddy Zach called me on the phone right now and said, bro, I'm in a bad spot, bro. Can you cash at me $500, man? Here's what happened. This happened. I'm getting 2 tires replaced. I lost this. I'll give you the money right back. I'd be like, yeah, absolutely, bro. Sure.
Yep.
If it was his voice.
Get this. There's a story, and maybe for your show notes, I'll have to find the link to it. I'll make sure I send it to you. There's a story about a mother sitting down in her living room watching TV, and she gets a phone call, and it's her daughter frantically crying, saying, Mom, they took me, they got me, please help. And then she goes off into the distance, fades off, like kind of in the background whimpering. And a voice gets on the phone saying, if you don't pay X amount of money to this account, you'll never see your daughter again. Think about the sense of urgency they created right then, right? That's a big part of the process, right? You got to get that urgency built up. And then they created a motivation, and then they basically told her exactly what to do. Like they even said, look, you're going to do it in Bitcoin. I think I'm maybe adding a little bit to the story with the method of payment, but I know for a fact it was get it done now, or you're never going to see your daughter again. The lady literally was on the verge of paying. Of course, they did the usual. Don't call law enforcement. Don't call the cops. The worst thing you could possibly do, all the usual. Had the daughter not walked down the stairs going, hey, Mom, what are you up to? And she looked up and she's like, I just got a phone call from you. She's like, what are you talking about? I've been in my bedroom the whole time. They grabbed sound clips from her off her whatever social media accounts and compiled enough of the voice nuances and cadence, everything you just said, to create a perfect script that people fell for. So yeah, that's happened. Like that literally happened like 2-3 months ago, and it was kind of hit the news pretty heavily, and then it's now gone a little bit quiet on that kind of thing. But because the next evolution of it's video, right? You're going to have the audio and the video, right? It's going to be a perfect match. It's going to be a perfect Karim, and there's not going to be much ability to discern it. The authenticity is at stake now, where you don't even know what's real anymore, and it's a new bastion, man. It's a whole new era for criminals.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember reading an article about a Russian that spoke good English. And there were there's a Russian like hacking group or whatever, where they were calling up. They would call up and get like increases on people's credit cards, or they would borrow money in their names. And then the company would say, well, can you call us? And so they paid him to call the company, because he had a good enough American accent that he could get on the phone and explain, yes, I'm so-and-so. And they would give him the information. My social security number is this, my date of birth there, here's my address. And they would ask him a few questions. And he said, sometimes, they would ask questions that I didn't know. And I'd say, I'm sorry, like I can't recall. Or he'd give him the wrong answer and be like, well, I had several roommates in college. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I lived in a dorm. And they go, okay, well, let me give you another one. And, they would pull like a LexisNexis report and start asking questions. And eventually he'd be able to get a few of them right. And then boom, they just gave him $100,000, whatever, home equity line of credit on his house. And they immediately transferred the money. And, so you don't even need that guy now, especially with the North Koreans and, that sort of thing. Like now if they can get into an organization,
yes, and
they can make a phone call from the CEO or president or whoever in that person's voice, once they get the lay of the land and know enough about the company, Bob can call Jennifer in HR or in bookkeeping or whatever. I mean, who knows like how.
Well, and mining the internet now is all been done forever. And, there's practically nothing you can't get publicly, open source wise these days, like the good old days of having to use Hoovers or Nexus, they're kind of gone. Everything's generally open sourced at this point through social media and all that. And now, this idea that they're trying to train these machine learning models on data that's been curated. It's all sliced, diced, organized. I had an interview not long ago about, it's a little off track, but it's interesting because it does have to do with reconnaissance, right? Or casing an environment, if you want to call it that. Now, I mean, the major players are looking at your house through Google Maps and Google Earth, and they're checking what kind of car you have. They're looking at what neighborhood you're in. They see what route you take to your job based on your cell phone connectivity to towers, and they see where you stop to have your coffee, because they can profile you for knowing exactly how much money you're worth probably paying based on whatever scam might be appropriate. So like they all that's kind of pre-digested and ready to rock for a lot of these threat actors. And it's at a scale it's unprecedented. And there's really not much defense against that. This is the thing that's interesting. You're relying on people's wherewithal and spidey sense to kick in, if you will, which, I mean, I hate to say it, but the vast majority of people, when it comes to these technical type scams, look, man, I would fall for a lot of this AI generated voice stuff and video stuff if it wasn't absurd. Like the funny ones that we see are pretty silly, right? They're people saying the most off the wall things. But if they say something slightly off from what they would normally say, I'd totally buy it. Like what your wife did with your Art of the Steal reading that you didn't do, but your avatar read, or whatever you want to call it, right?
Right.
So I mean,
I think that it all, and I'm not gonna say it depends. Like if somebody called up and said, "Oh, we've got your wife and we need, whatever, $30,000," I'd be like, "What'd you guys miscalculate?" But somebody else may say, "Of course, it has to be reasonable." So, but yeah, I definitely, I hear you. And, I was going to say, you can track people so many different ways. Like there's so many different things you can do. What I was wondering about is you wrote a book about cryptocurrency, right?
No, I was probably quoted in a few of those, but I didn't write a book on it specifically. But which one are you referring to?
The rise of the central bank digital currencies. Yeah.
So sorry, that is my the Substack stuff. So yeah, sorry, I was thinking of a physical book that was printed. That was never printed. That was an article I wrote about.
Okay.
BDCs is what you're referring to. Like
I thought it was like an ebook, but okay, no, just
it's a publication, but yeah, it's on like Substack.
Nah. Okay,
but yeah, close enough. I did. I definitely found it to be a very interesting utility. We'll call it that. I don't know where you want to go with it because there's a lot we could talk about with CBDC.
Well, here's what I was thinking, because I know that there's like the what is it, Fed coin? Is that what so and I was thinking if they moved, if the government moved, I mean, obviously there's all the conspiracy theories, they can just say, hey, hey, guess what? You've been buying too much gas lately. You can't do that anymore. You can only spend this much on this, or, oh, you've been bad, so you can only spend so much on food, or whatever it may be. If you don't get the next vaccine, we're not going to allow you to buy groceries anymore. Whatever. There's all these, the worst case scenarios. Well, what I was thinking is like, what does that do? And I'm only wondering this is because of the North Korean scam where they were tracking all the money and they got such a substantial amount back. Like for illicit types of organizations, drugs, for instance, even fraud, you could track everything from here on out. So even if it was a year and a half later and they said, hey, we just found out this loan was a fraud and it was whatever, it was, identity theft, or, hey, this was a transaction that was made and guess what? That was 5 kilos of cocaine. Like you can now track all that back. So do you feel like that eliminates certain types of crimes? And how do criminals get around that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It will 100%, in my opinion, create an obsolescence with existing methods, right? That you just can't do anymore, because the internet never forgets. And you're 100% right. They can always go and watch the tape, to use a sports analogy, and do it, like you said, however many years later, because they simply have the computing power to go dig through it and figure out what maybe happened and then go indict someone. So you're right. That will absolutely change the game for criminals to have to figure out how to overcome that. However, the parallel to this is that cyber criminals are probably embracing that type of tech faster than the good guys are. In some cases, they're actually in classic fashion, they're finding the utility of things like the AI stuff we're talking about, where they're truly anonymized. And they for example, when you had to create, or we talked about Frank Abagnale when we had our first conversation, when you had to create a fake check where you put the little logo on there, now you can have essentially a really well-tuned AI art program create it for you better than you could ever do it. You just need to have the printing facility.
Right.
Frankly, most things aren't even physical anymore anyway. Your boarding passes certainly are not to get on an airplane. Why would you bother? You just need to make sure you have the record there, and then you have the record here, and you're good to go. So I think that we'll see, and to not sound hyperbolic with the statement, but I think we're going to see a new breed of sort of criminal / hacker come about that don't need too much technical capability, because it's all built to be run and operated. So you don't even need to be really good at building it anymore. You just have to operate it. And I think that's what we're going to see a shift towards. But the surveillance state, just to kind of finish off on your question, I don't think that'll slow down. I think you're 100% right. I mean, there's going to be a whole push using, we'll call it fear tactics, to say it's in everyone's best interest for us to watch everything. And people will capitulate to that, because people will say, what's a little privacy, giving up a little privacy for security, because that's the trade-off. I think most people will probably give into that. It'll be the criminals will probably be a little less willing to share.
Right. I was going to say,
they'll
come up with some kind of thing, and they'll come up with some kind of barter system, or they'll trade in something else. They're going to figure out.
There'll be a shadow economy, just like anything else. It's kind of what I think that everyone thought or was worried that crypto would sort of become, hence the regulation push. But see, this is what's so ironic about it all. Cryptocurrency, just broadly speaking, not one or the other, not specifically Bitcoin or any of the others. The whole power of it and the value of it is it's decentralized, right? It's not meant to be controlled by one operator. That's kind of the whole point. So the minute you start to do that, like this Fed one, Fed Next, or whatever they're calling this TBDC, it's really just a recreation of the federal bank, but done in electronic fashion, where the money's programmable to be different for Matt than it is for me. That's all it is. But it's no more. It's not distributed. It's not a decentralized system. It's still centralized. So it kind of defeats the purpose of something that's kind of hard to hack. So it'll become a huge target, in my opinion. If they centralize it, well, now you can point your cannons at it. That's where put it this way, that's where hacktivists will probably target.
Right.
Because now it's something a lot harder, a lot easier to hack than something you're going back to castle moat strategy versus decentralized, which the very nature of decentralization makes it very difficult to hack. When you centralize it, it's a target.
Yeah, I mean, you can as much of a, like you just said, like as much of a moat as you can put around it. It's like, okay, that's great, and you centralize it, but the truth is all you got to do is get through once. And that's the thing I always said about law enforcement was I was like, listen, I can't make a mistake. Like law enforcement only has to be right. They can make 1,000 mistakes. They only got to be right once to get their hands on me. Right. So, that's frightening. Of course, I also, my wife is, I was told in the comment section that I shouldn't say she's a conspiracy nut. She's very, listen, she'll get something in her head, and for like a week, at least a week, I have to hear about it and watch shows on it. And one of them was about the grid going down.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it's so bad that like I was in New York and I took a picture of the skyline and I sent it to her. And it wasn't, it's beautiful. Wow, that's amazing. It was, God, I wouldn't want to be there if the grid goes down. And I was like, that's what where your mind went. But
Yeah.
Oh, listen, though, I got dried beans. I got top ramen soup. We got a lot of water. We have a
You're
3
full-blown
foot.
prepper now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. She wants an acre way away from everybody, because all we have to do is survive 3 months until everybody kills each other off and 80% of them will be gone. Then we only have to deal with the 20%. And we can survive that. And I'm just like, what are you doing? You're a crazy person, right? I don't know who you are. But so yeah, I watched the grid going down, and about how I guess it's China was trying to hack the grid, and China and Russia to try and kind of, I don't know what they were trying to get into, but their big concern is how vulnerable the electrical grid is in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big one.
It's semi-decentralized.
You're right. There's a daisy chain cascading effect, or domino effect.
Right,
is the problem.
They were like, if you only have to take out so much, and then the whole thing with that. They were talking about Texas like a year ago.
Right. Exactly. Well, here's the thing, and this is one that we could probably do an entirely separate show on for like 2 hours on it, because here's the reason why. There's so many layers to this. The first layer is that your wife's not crazy about the fact that the power grid is indeed pretty vulnerable by the sheer nature of what it is. And what I mean by that is it's old.
Right.
So it's running off incredibly old and obsolete software, basically. And the problem is most things can't be retrofitted with new software because, again, it's this whole daisy chain effect. If you can't fix one piece and not the other, if you fix this piece, the other parts don't work with it. It's just this mess. A lot of the companies that built this stuff, the software part of it, are out of business now. They're gone. And it's like you ever go to the airport and you see them printing out the manifest for the plane, and they have the dot matrix printer.
Yeah.
That's because the software is written to work only with those printers. They can't go plug in a nice laser printer to it anymore. It just doesn't work. So
it's funny. I flew like Delta one time, and it was the worst ticket. It was this old thick ticket that was a dot matrix, and this was only like a couple years ago. It was hard to read the whole thing, and I was like, I don't understand. I'm flying like Value Jet, and I got a nice, clean, easy to read ticket. And look at this thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't even think about that. I just was like, well, why don't they upgrade? I was like, but yeah, I didn't even realize that they've been around forever. They're still using this. Their whole system's based on this technology that is difficult to upgrade.
That's the first problem. The second problem is the actual physical hardware. The big transformers that our country effectively like lives off of, these things, if they go down, we don't have spares, which sucks.
Right.
And guess where the spares would get made?
No, in China.
No. China. And you know how long it would take for them to do it if they even wanted to do it for us? Like a year or two to get some of these things made.
Yeah, I was seeing that. Like the turnaround time is outrageous. And then you're not ordering one or two of them at that point. You'd have to order. You're trying to get them to make hundreds, thousands of them.
And nothing's worse for getting a backup transformer than bad geopolitical relations with the country that makes it for you. So there's some really scary propositions there. And then lastly, there's a daisy chain. So for example, why bother with the grid if you can go after water treatment? Because if you can go after water treatment, which might be an easier target because it's not as high profile as the power grid is, now you make water I'm not trying to make this a doom and gloom session here, but it is valuable to know. All of a sudden the water's not drinkable, Matt, and you're drinking water that creates mass dysentery in a town that overruns the hospitals. Now all you have to do is pressurize a power grid. You don't have to hack it. You just pressurize it that much more when it's overburdened. So, just like the beginning of our conversation, we talked about attacking on moonless night or waiting until there's a national holiday. Wait for a harsh winter. I mean, these are old strategy and tactics that aren't forgotten, right? Art of war is alive and well in terms of military strategies for this. So yeah, there's a frailty here that's hard to fix. And everyone kind of asks me that. They're like, why don't they just fix it all? It's like, well, there's this huge litany of things that are all interrelated and interlaced that make it almost impossible to fix in any meaningful amount of time for nothing less than billions of dollars of expenditure. So sadly, we're kind of in a bad place. Yeah.
The government's also very, reactive.
Yeah, very much so. There's got to be a compelling event of some kind. Yeah.
The only proactive thing that they do really is like the military. We may need this type of a jet in the future. We have to stay ahead of the curve. And so they're always pushing to be ahead. But in almost every other way, it's crisis legislation. Even though this is an issue, I know, but it's manageable right now. And I'm not going to get reelected if I start pushing for an agenda that nobody else thinks is an issue. Let's wait for there to be a crisis.
The minute the politics play a part in this, it's all over pretty much, because it's not going to really address the urgency of something. But and then, I talked about water, but there's even one probably even more concerning than even like water and energy, and it's communications. If you simply take down communications, everything else is now like you separated the deer from the herd, and it's fair game. I mean, this is what's scary about this idea of a coordinated cyber warfare attack. Now, the reason it doesn't happen, I think, believe me, I don't know 100%. These are just speculations after 30 years of doing this or so, is because that would constitute an act of war. And this has been the weird line that's been drawn in the sand that no one quite knows where it is that what hack by either a nation state group or a cyber criminal group constitutes an act of war. There's no clear like rules of engagement with that. You know what I mean? But that one would probably step over the line, because it'd be the equivalency of someone firing a missile into our power grids in the US. It's the same equivalency. So I think that's probably where they're sort of stepping back and saying, let's not push the limits. That's kind of an act of war. Let's play it cool. Let's do recon. Let's go sniff around. Let's loiter. Let's figure out where the flaws are. But then let's not push the limits too much to where we actually incited an entire international incident that could be move straight to a kinetic attack or war. Right. So, yeah, that's probably why it hasn't happened, to be honest.
All right. All right. Well, let's, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think any of that helped, is going to help my wife's issues.
Eat into that, and you'll have 2-3 weeks worth of.
Listen, I have a water. I had to buy this $150 water filtration thing. It's got a pump and it's the whole thing. I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
I keep telling her, you should try it out. We've got a pond. There's a pond over there. I'm telling you, go drink, go take care of it.
Yeah.
And so I bought her almost as I don't want to say as a joke, because it's not a joke, but almost just to be, haha. I bought her this thick survival guide.
Right. Loved it.
She's about halfway through it.
Pretty cool, man.
She's totally into it. She's watching this guy, Canadian Prepper. This guy, I don't know if you know who that is. This guy, every day we've been on the brink because I have a buddy who watches him. And so I heard about him about 2-3 years ago. So for 2 or 3 years, periodically I'll catch a 5-minute clip here or a minute clip here. It's always going under. For 2 or 3 years now, we are on the verge. It's over.
Yeah.
This guy, his whole thing is doom and gloom. I'm on the other side. I think it's going to be fine. They know they know what they're doing.
You're also a survivalist, I think instinctively. So there's preppers and then the survivalists, and sometimes there's an overlap. But the reality is this, that this is an interesting thing to think about, because if we went into a lawless environment for a while, That's interesting, right? I don't mean in a good way. I mean, it's fascinating because guys like you and I and other folks that you've interviewed, we're probably more equipped to think about the ramifications of what that means than most. Most are just going, well, because look, the U.S., unless you've been in inner cities or big cities with some of the crazy stuff that's happened over the years, I live in suburbia and when I'm in the U.S. and I don't see riots and looting and all that. I've never seen it live,
right?
But if it ever did happen where there was a true blackout, think about like the opportunistic opportunity. Think about the panic, and then the groups that feel like they're underserved and the opportunity that it presents itself. It would be pretty crazy. So I think the truth of the matter is that there are some really interesting concerns around these topics when it comes to where the psychology of the world goes to when things like that happen. Because I mean, look, think about, we haven't talked too much about how you went from where you were as a child to where you got to where you went to prison and now where you are today. But there had to have been a psychological shift somewhere. You weren't just born ready to go do the stuff you did. You got there due to something that compelled you to go there. And I think certain activities like this, especially with the hackers, by the way, coming back to that really quickly, those criminals feel like gods.
Oh, I'm sure.
Right. And that's where they get cocky. That's where they make mistakes. Right. So there's some of that. But it's an interesting thing because crises like we're talking about will accelerate that behavior in by the droves of people. And I think that's where that's really scary, right? Because the damage you could have caused individually. Imagine hundreds of you running around scamming people. Like, I'm not talking about like fire bombs and loitering and breaking windows. I'm talking about now there's some desperation in the world and there's some like depressive qualities because the economy's hit due to certain things. That's going to engender and foster more of that behavior. It just will. Desperation will cause, necessity will create that. And then
the mother of invention is necessity.
Yeah. And then you add success to that equation, Matt, and what happens then? You get people blood drunk on the success of it and they're ready to take the chances.
Yeah. I was going to say when I probably rewrote my book like 3 times. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I finally did was I ordered a few books but really it's probably the best book I read was somebody actually just gave me this little book. I'll bet you it wasn't 100 pages. And it was written by a woman who had written 3 memoirs. And I read that memoir or that book, and it was just great. Like, it was like, she was so just, she didn't sugarcoat anything. And she explained all of these things that I thought that really I was like, wow. And she was like, look, even if you don't think there are certain things in your childhood that helped shape the person that you are, find those things, look for them, because they're there. They may not be obvious to you, but if you look for them, they are there. And so, you need to find them and you need to include them in your book because the reader is going to want to point to certain situations in your past that helped, shape the person that you are. And even though some of the other books I had read had said similar types of things, they had never been that clear and crisp. And this woman, talk about brevity. Like what a short book, but just every word was important. Yeah. And I read that, and after I read that, I rewrote my book. And the difference between people reading my book prior to that rewrite and after that rewrite was night and day. I mean, I had guys coming up to me I had guys telling me how amazing the book was with tears in their eyes, just like, bro, like what that thing about your dad. Like, and they're just in tears, their eyes welled up. And I was just like, wow, this is amazing. Like, so, definitely, the whole being able to point to things that help shape you. That was hugely important. That was huge. And the other thing is, I'm sorry, I was going to say the other thing you mentioned too, which was crucial, is that you're right. It's she also explained to, like how you felt, why you felt that way, why you felt, how you felt afterward. What were the things that led up, to making that decision or this decision? And one of the things you said was, and I always say this, is that like every time I got away with something, I became more and more emboldened by it.
Yeah.
And when you said the God thing, like I used to always, and I've said this on numerous podcasts where I said, there is no better feeling in the world than walking into a bank, handing them a fake ID, a bunch of fake W-2s, fake pay stubs, fake bank statements, a fake ID, closing on a loan, and having them hand you a check for $250,000 and thank you for ripping them off. I mean, you feel like James Bond. You walk out of there feeling like I have everything's under control. I can handle everything. I'll never get caught. I'm just that good. And you walk out and you feel it's a feeling that's just, it's better than any drug. It's amazing.
It's so interesting you're saying that, because the closest thing it's really interesting. So the gentleman that introduced you and I, Arsenic, soon that show will be out, whether it's before this one or after this one comes out. Nonetheless, it's really cool when guys like him, yourself, and me, coming from worlds, completely different paths, are able to have this intersection and have a meaningful conversation about that kind of strategy and that rush, because that's the key thing that drives us all in a similar way, whether we're the black out of the white hat in the equation, or formerly black, now white, or maybe black, now gray, working for the government.
Right.
You name it. It's interesting because there's the same motivation. I spoke to a couple of special operations guys that are not in a good place. They're suffering from PTSD from being out in Afghanistan and Iraq and all that. But what's so interesting with people see that as a very binary thing. They're like, oh, these poor guys, they're suffering from PTSD. It's such a shame. You know what they struggle with the most? A lot of the guys, not everyone. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this, but a lot of the guys miss it. They miss the rush. The adrenaline from that is so high. In like my career path, it's been really fascinating. I get to chase extremely sophisticated threat actors everywhere, and I get paid for that. It's pretty cool. I was gonna say
it's like being you're an investigator, and how cool is it for you to? I can imagine you get on a conference call, you call up. You're talking to all these IT guys that are panicking. And if you're the guy that walks in and you say, okay, well, hold on. I just looked at it. Here's what's happening. Here's this, here's that. You need to do this. And you just boom, 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 boom. And everybody goes, wow, I never thought, oh my gosh. So what if I do that? And you just bam, bam, bam. And you're the guy that's got all the answers when there's 5 other guys that are experts that have panicked or are just in complete panic mode, and you walk in and boom, 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 boom. Here's what happens. Here's how we fix it. Here's this. Fix this. Call me back in an hour. You get off that phone call. You must feel like,
that's
God, I'm good. God, I'm good.
No doubt. That's the ego explosion. But then there's an interesting thing. The parallel to your story about being at the teller and getting that check for $250,000. That's when I've been poring over some sort of data or findings or telemetry or something. And I'm looking for this proverbial, not even a needle in a haystack, because I can't even use a magnet. I'm looking for a toothpick in a haystack. Right. And I find it. And I'm like, that's where he slipped up. It's kind of like the movies we've seen where he gets this one little thing, this one little break, this one thread that unravels the whole sweater. That's the exhilaration from my side of the house. And it's probably very much shared with law enforcement groups that are really dedicated to their craft, is that when you finally get this one thing where he's like, he finally or she finally made a mistake, that God complex got the better of them. And now they just did that one thing they shouldn't have done. They took the chance to not bother setting up the VPN right, or they didn't bother with a proxy, or they didn't, something where they didn't cover their tracks or obfuscate themselves. There's that same location.
I was just saying, it's the parking ticket with Berkowitz, the son of Sam, the parking ticket. Like there's 500 police officers who have scoured every single lead for the last 6 months, and some guy said, let's check the parking tickets. Like, what if this guy somebody got a parking ticket the night of the murder that shouldn't have been there, that maybe lives somewhere else, maybe got a parking ticket. I mean, how remote is that possibility? And sure enough, Berkowitz got a parking ticket. He doesn't live in this borough. Why is he in this borough?
Yep.
They check, they call the precinct. I know that guy. He's a nut. They make a few phone calls. They watch him for a day or two. That's it. It's obvious it's him. Look at all the, he's been writing letters. Look, he lives on this street. He mentioned this, that name of this street here. This, like, he just names them off, and it's like, holy shit. Like, what a random, how did that guy feel? How did that detective feel?
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. And it's funny. It's either laziness or ego that is usually the catalyst for the failure when it comes to a criminal doing something. It's rarely bad process. I mean, there's always the ones that get caught, like all the funny videos of criminals that do the stupidest heists ever. Those are obvious. But I'm talking about the ones that have really spent the time to figure out how to do it. It's fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it's that one little slip up. What I'd be curious about? When it comes to, like, I get people ask me this question a lot. They're like, so do you hire hackers, that are bad and reform them and this and that? And it's like, yes and no. Many times I'll catch something in the process of being set up by maybe someone that's young and aspiring, and it's not quite there yet, but it's like, that's some good work. Right. But they're really, they would do really well working on the good guy side, right? Like coming in. And by the way, when I say the good guy side, we talked about this several times in this chat. Good guy, the perk is you don't sleep looking over your shoulder, waiting for the feds to kick the door in. That's worth a lot of money, dude. Like that's worth your life.
Not only that, I don't think these guys realize how much money there is in cybersecurity.
Huge amounts.
I mean, it's ridiculous. I told you there was like one guy I knew who was actually in prison for hacking. Yeah. And talk about when I remember we said talk about somebody who has a touch of Asperger's syndrome. Yeah. This guy, it was very difficult for him to even make eye contact. He nicest guy. So we started talking, and he was 19 when he got indicted. He ended up getting 6 years. He did 5 years. And he had been on heroin. He was stealing information. The crime that he ended up selling, the dumps, I forget how many, whatever it was, 100,000 or 30,000 credit card profiles that he had sold. He made $500 on. He had to do 5 years for that. Had been arrested several times. So he had a criminal record, but it was all for drug possession.
Sure.
So, on the federal sentencing guidelines, he was like a level 4 or 5, but they were all like possession or maybe sales, but minor sales. Like these dudes were all probation. He'd never been to prison. So he ends up getting a chunk of time and had never had a driver's license. So I remember he was going to be out in 5 months, probably less than 6 months. And he used to come and talk to me all the time because he said I was interesting to talk to. The bar's low in prison. So it's not me. But I was always working on writing guys' stories. I wrote a bunch of true crime stories. Just guys, eventually you hear so many true crime stories. Every once in a while I'd hear one, I'd be like, man, bro, I need to write. do you mind if would you let me write a story about you? And it'd be nothing. It'd be 10,000 words or something. And I'd order gave me something to do. I'd order the Freedom of Information Act on the guy. I'd order his transcripts. I'd all these things through the mail, by the way. So I'd order all these. So it gave me time. My name gets called at mail call. I write letters. I get. I did that the last 7 years, maybe, that I was there. So I remember this guy, no father, and we were talking, and I was like, well, what are you going to do when you get out? He's like, oh, I don't know. And I was like, okay, well, you're going to need, you started at the bottom. You're going to need ID. I know when I get to the halfway house, I'll take care of that. What do you mean get to the halfway house? You can do it now. They had something they called it the flow bus. I'm like, I'm walking out here with a driver's license.
Yeah.
Oh, I figure I'll do it in the halfway house. I'm like, why would you do that? You have all the time in the world right now.
Yeah.
So we do that. So we help him get his driver's license. And then he was like, I was like, what are you gonna do for a living? He's like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm a felon now, so I don't think I can really do anything. And I was like, what do you like doing? He's like, well, I mean, I like computers. I like programming. I like hacking. I like this. I go, well, aren't there those guys? Aren't they called like penetration specialists or something? He's like, oh, I know, but he's like, was locked up. I'm a felon. And he said, I can't do that. I'm like, whoa. I said, listen, bro. I said, you're making the common mistake that most of these guys make. Like every con man that was in there was actively trying to figure out how to cover up his scams. Right. How do I cover up the news reports? How do I cover up my name? Can I change my name? Can I get reputation.com to bury my information? Can I this? Like, to me, you're working on your next felony. Or you're working on your next indictment by doing that. And I was like, I was the only one in there who was actively saying, oh, I'm telling everybody what I did.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make sure. And I was gonna say, so for him, I told him, I said, you need to look at this as your calling card.
Yeah.
Said, bro, I've been locked up at that point 12 years or something. I was like, I've never met any hackers. You know, right. You can turn this into something. You know, we can get you a Wikipedia page. We can start naming all the things you can do. We can write your story. We can rewrite your story. And I said, you need to figure out how to get licensing, because I think most of these guys get like certificates. And I said, he's like, yeah, but I'm a felon. I go, yeah, but these aren't, the government doesn't give you, the government isn't the person who's giving you the license. So I said, these are just certificates by individual companies. So they're not going to care that you're a felon. And I said, so I said, you need to order that stuff now. So he actually ordered several books. And within a few months, he was like, listen, there's like, I forget what he had said. It was like, there's 5 major things, certificates you need. This one. By the time I got out of, and he was like, no company's going to hire me. I said, no. Most of these hacking companies and these penetration specialists and cybersecurity companies, most of them hire companies that are subcontractors. That company will probably hire you. This company will get certified to work for this company. This company gets the contracts. They don't even know that you work for them. And so we were talking, and by the time I got out and we spoke, by this point I'd gotten out of the halfway house. He got out before me. He had 4 of like these 5 major certificates, and he was going for the 5th one, which was huge. I mean, we're talking about days of being well, you know what they are, days of being tested. Yeah. Then he had to go in front of a board that questioned him. Like he had passed them all flying, because he was brilliant. This is a guy who would sit down for 20 hours straight in front of and not eat and do nothing but play on the computer and design things and whatever they call it. Anyway, this guy's he was making over $150,000 within 2 years of being out of prison, because his bosses were like, you're insane. Like his bosses who had been doing it, some of them 10, 15, 20 years, were like, you're just better than me.
Sure.
You know,
that's it. You nailed it. That's actually the key thing. It's the natural proclivity to think that way. So here's a funny story. So, other people you've interviewed in the same world that I'm in, that we all know each other, would probably arguably say a very similar thing. A lot of the folks that we call them Boy Scouts, the ones that work for the government that have the perfect record, they get all the CSSCI level clearances and all that. It's not that they're bad at what they do at all. This is not about an indictment of their skill. What's funny is that they just can't think in a way that is applicable to the problem. Like, in other words, when I'm on a hunt, I'm literally thinking like the criminal. I'm not thinking like the investigator. And a lot of people, don't realize that that's part of the training that law enforcement goes through, which is you have the profilers, really good example of the people that are like chasing around really scary people, like serial killers. There's a lot of shows that now show that. But that's very much that talent what's so interesting is that people that listen to your show that maybe are in a state of either recovery from from that world, or they're upset with the world and they're contemplating going into it. You said it best. There's huge opportunities that are not apparent sometimes. They're not very clear that you could actually do something legitimate using those skills. It's not that you have to forego that. You're doing exactly that now. You've literally taken, these are fascinating stories. There's a lot of people that listen to this because they're really interested in how you think, or how people like you think, because it's something so foreign to them. There's a lot of very innocent people in the world that can't even begin to conceive of how you would even start a scam. They're like, how would you even begin? And it's like, well, pretty obvious to me. And it's pretty obvious to you, but it's not obvious to a lot of folks.
Well, I think, it's like people saying, like, well, how could I get a driver's license in your name?
Right.
I don't know your social security number. I don't know your date of birth. I don't even think I know your full name. Assuming you have a middle name, like, how do you go about doing that? And, even if I knew that information, how do I order those documents? Well, the moment they say, oh, we need a copy of your driver's license, they're like, I don't have his driver's license. I can't get the document. I can't get his birth certificate. I don't have his driver's license. It's like, stop. How could he get it? Well, he has his driver's license. What if his house burned down and he had nothing, and he was naked standing outside of his house, or he was in his underwear standing outside of his house watching everything he has burn, and both of his parents were deceased, and everything's gone? How would he get it? Well, I guess he wouldn't. Really, he wouldn't get it. You think that there's no vehicle out there that allows him to get a copy of his driver's license from scratch? Well, I guess, and you go, listen. So to me, I always started thinking immediately, they only want a copy. So it only has to look like a driver's license. They don't know what he looks. Well, it doesn't have his picture on it. They don't know what he looks like.
Yeah.
This is some woman sitting in the statistical, in the birth certificate office, 15 states away. If she gets a cashier's check for $25, it says, I want a certified copy of his driver's license or his birth certificate, and it has all the questions filled out correctly, and it's got a copy of a driver's license, she's sending you the birth certificate. So it was all these, to me, it was always like, there's a way to get this. And I just had to figure out that way. And once you get one or two documents, it's that you crack the door. I can kick that door wide open. And now I have everything. And all those documents start being used to gather more documents. And before you know it, I'm you, and I'm walking into your bank account and your bank, or I'm applying for a loan and your property, or I'm doing all these things that people think aren't possible. Yeah. It's like everybody has certain skill sets. And I used to teach the real estate class in prison. I taught it for 10 years. So I taught it at a medium security prison for 3 years and 7 years at the low security prison. And I used to walk in because, these guys, like you got a bunch of drug dealers in there, and, they have no education. They don't have it. Maybe they have a prison GED, and they're sitting in there and they're trying to figure out, these guys are getting out soon and they don't know what to do. They're either they've decided they're going back to prison, or they're going to be a rapper, or they're going to, they don't know what to do. And then some of them are like, well, maybe I could do real estate or something, or fix up houses or something. And I would go in there, and one of the first things I'd say is like, are there anybody here for drugs? And they raise their hand, and I'd be like, whew, this is probably one of the few chances or few times in your life that being a drug dealer is going to be a major advantage to you. You have a hustler mentality. You're used to going into rough neighborhoods. You don't mind knocking on a door and being turned down. Like right now, you guys are about to shine. And listen, I had guys walking out of that class, stopping me at the door and shaking my hand. Like, bro, that was amazing. That was an amazing class. And I would have guys come to me, and I'd be in the chow hall or something, and then some guy would walk up. He'd go, hey, bro, my cellie is taking your class. And I'm like, okay. He's like, I'm going to sign up next quarter. And I'd go, oh, okay. How come? He'd go, listen, this dude just came in the other day and he said, I'm taking Matt Cox's real estate course. He goes, I'm going to be a millionaire, bro. telling you right now, he said, all I got to do. And he's like, I never seen this dude so excited about anything my whole life. He's ordering real estate books from the street. Like he's just from, because it's true. Like, and I used to say, like, do you think that a 40-year-old divorcee white woman is going to go into a neighborhood that you'll go into?
Right.
Like, she doesn't have that hustler mentality. She wants to sit behind a desk. She wants to talk to other women like her. And, like you guys can go get those deals. You guys can, you just have to know, how to talk, correctly. You need to know how a closing takes place, how negotiations take place, how to write a contract, what a closing means, what documents need to be signed, so we go through all that. And, but yeah, I think that most people, they don't play to their strengths. And a lot of times they think their strengths are weaknesses, and that's another problem.
Very well said. Very well said. It's funny, Matt. So my day job, one of them, I have several things that I do, but one of them is actually helping ultra high net worth individuals and family offices stay secure. And it began very similar to the ways that you were talking about that friend of yours that went into the world of penetration testing and vulnerability assessments and all that. And then it grew out from there. And this is a long time ago. This is in the late 90s. So I'm ancient when it comes to this. But as far as the way it evolved is I started to provide counterintelligence and countermeasure services to my clients. And what that is predicting where the threat will be coming from and setting up essentially not traps, because the goal isn't to necessarily catch the adversary, because that's, like you said, there's no point. It's more just deter them, move along, go find a lower hanging fruit or easier target. But it was fascinating because a lot of these people that are uber successful, and they feel like God's in their own way because they've somehow either made money through family means, or there's a trust fund situation, or maybe they were inventive and ingenious with something, and ultimately it manifested into huge wealth. Whenever I tell them that we're going to have to do this, this, and this, and this, because this is probably a way that they're going to come at you, they're gobsmacked. They have no idea how the hell we came up with that as a risk. And then we cite all the ways that they are exposed. And they're like, oh my God, I had no idea that was a way that I could be infiltrated. And it's funny because it takes people that are inclined and have the proclivity, or maybe, and I hate to say it, maybe there's been a desperation in their lives to have to become that hustler, to have their mind and the synapses in their mind evolve in such a way that make them think that way. And I mean, I'm sure you'd agree with me. Once you think that way, you can never not think that way again.
Right.
You will always think like that. Whether you act on it or not's beside the point, but you'll always think about it. And it's cool because it's like, well, that's a superhero power, man. Like, Matt, you've got a superhero power. And that's what you were bringing out with those guys in prison. I think that's amazing because they shouldn't be praised for the bad behavior, but they should be absolutely encouraged for the skill that they've been able to engender to use it for something else. Right. I had folks that worked for me that have been in a less than savory position and have done some time, and they had a very similar story. And look, for one, I've never had more loyal and capable folks work for me than people that have probably been through a rough period. Oh, yeah. And have a new opportunity presented to them where they get to use those skills, but for something completely good. And it's awesome, man. I love those guys.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've been told in the comment section to thank my guests. Listen, my comment section is nothing but just, telling me how I should be doing things and things that I'm doing badly, which, it's fine. It's constructive criticism. So thank you very much for taking the time to, or spending this time with me.
My pleasure.
Hey, I appreciate you guys watching the interview. If you liked it, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you get notified of videos just like this. Leave me a comment in the comment section. Also, please consider joining my Patreon. And I really appreciate you guys. See ya.